Thank you so much. I am delighted to be here. Thank you to everybody who has helped to make this possible. I'm really happy to share with you the work of Jorge Portilla, who is a Mexican phenomenologist who I believe deserves more attention than he's gotten. And his work was untranslated into English up until very recently. The topic of my talk today is the new romantic right. Jorge Portilla on the spiritual roots of fascism. As you see here on the screen, we have in visual form a bit of the puzzle that I'm going to be chewing on today. How do you go from the festival of Trump to such a strict and narrow authoritarianism? It seems like those are the opposites. And so the hope is that Jorge Portilla can help us sort of see past the churn of events to some of the deeper forces that are shaping this flow. Here is the philosopher, Jorge Portilla. And in this talk, I want to focus on a piece that concerns Portilla's treatment of Thomas Mann. Thomas Mann is a well-known German novelist and wrote this fantastic novel called The Magic Mountain. And Jorge Portilla trashes it. And he does it in the most dramatic way, but offering lots of insights along the way. This is his piece. It's called Thomas Mann and German Irrationalism, and he begins by saying, "I have the floor on Thomas Mann for 40 minutes. That man of genius is at my mercy. I can do with him as I please. I can praise him or I can denounce him. I can talk about him intelligently or stupidly. The dead lion is delivered to the maw of the living dog." So he recognizes that Thomas Mann is great and he's just a dog and he gets to trash him as the critic. And yet here I am later, I get to trash Portilla and this is how we do it. I love Portilla's style of doing philosophy in this organic, living way. He wrote a lot for newspapers. He wanted to take philosophy to the streets, and he loved the way Thomas Mann did it as a novelist, being able to connect. And so it's in that spirit that I want to engage with his work. It is it should strike the reader as outrageous for Portilla to claim that Thomas Mann is somehow a representative of German irrationalism and this sort of deep spiritual foundation of Nazism, given that Thomas Mann fled the Nazis and was a prominent vocal critic, having a well-known BBC broadcast speaking out. And Portilla acknowledges this. He says Thomas Mann was a German romantic. He was trained in the school of Schopenhauer, Wagner, and Nietzsche, but he was certainly not a Nazi or a Hitler collaborator. He acknowledges that. Yet, he says, we will not find in his work philosophical principles that could have been opposed to National Socialism. This bourgeois, intelligent, and cultured man does not participate in the barbaric orgy. But how can we not see that the philosophical foundations of his work and the spiritual climate that it thrives in are the same as that in the name of which National Socialism tried to found a superior order that would govern the world for the next 1,000 years? This is an odd form of criticism. He's saying it doesn't matter if you agree, your work is an expression and thrives in a spiritual climate that contributes to fascism. That the philosophical foundations of your work, because it's part of this same world, these same stories, it doesn't actually have principles that could oppose in a meaningful way the unfolding of events. It is an odd type of criticism, and yet I feel like it is the kind of criticism that speaks to me, because the biggest question for me is how can we engage in this political moment in a way that is genuinely disruptive, that genuinely generates new possibilities that are not already captured in the logic of this system heading quickly toward what appears to be some tipping points. More on that later. So here's Portilla's warning. He's talking about this ambiguity between our attraction and repulsion to these romantic stories of purifying violence, that somehow the way we're going to get through this is by a dramatic change, a hitting of rock bottom, something that can shake the system and lead us back to the garden. Can we expect that one day the sinister ambiguity will finally be uprooted and banished from modern culture? In any case, I'm afraid that it will not be men like Thomas Mann who will help carry out this task. Again, I don't really want to pick on Thomas Mann. The question is, how many of us are ready if the challenge really does come? How many of our colleagues, when we look around, how many of the people who speak a certain way would really have the spiritual resources to resist? In contemporary Germany and even beyond its borders, under the ashes of prosperity, the embers of the will to power, hatred of reason, and fidelity to death are still alive, and it is not impossible that they may one day invade the world with a terrifying wave. So this is the warning. This is why we are talking about this, is the prospect of fascism reigniting, and that these ideas can take on a life of their own and can move with shocking speed. It's better if we take some time and continually practice talking and reasoning through and trying to hold our understanding of what is most important, our love, our courage, our commitments, so that when the storm does come, if it comes, that we are ready. Here in this quote, we see the three sort of defining features of the most ugly form of what Portilla sort of identifies as this romantic ideal of authenticity. And that is at its worst when it involves some sort of purifying violence. And the ways that people rationalize this, the ways they do the spiritual, emotional, cognitive gymnastics to go along with the unfolding of events in this way. When you unpack these ideas, these lines of justification and rationale, he says you find these three features. The will to power, the idea that deliberation is hopeless, so just exert power. Hatred of reason and fidelity to death, the idea that is through death, through confrontation with death, that we are most alive. Something like that. So here is the roadmap. We'll begin with a little bit of background about Portilla and fascism and me and where I come into this story. And then we'll look at Portilla's argument. So, we should be kind of skeptical. He's drawing this connection between German poetry and National Socialism. So really, how does he get there? And then Portilla's contemporary relevance. How much of this really can help us see things we didn't see before, intervene in more effective ways with regard to Christian nationalism in this countries, and eco-fascism in general, and then I'll provide just a brief conclusion and a word of advice at the end. I began my journey on this topic with with an essay that won the best prize on Latin American thought in 2018, as Serafine graciously pointed out in the introduction. The article was called "Surviving Social Disintegration," and it talked about the 2016 election. And if you remember the 2016 election, Donald Trump won. And in the run-up, it was remarkable. The angst of that time was very vivid to me, because it was this moment when people had this feeling that they didn't know who these people were that were voting for the other side. And both sides felt that way. And it was like, you are in another world. Who are these people? Where's my country? What are we? What is our values really? It was this moment of profound reflection and a sense that the disintegration that things were coming apart and it had become visible. I wanted to connect Portilla's work on this. He's a social theorist who spent his life thinking about social disintegration in nations. And he visited the US and he thought a lot about Germany. And in Mexico City, he was involved in all of these conversations about these topics. And the things that he says were so resonant with one of the books that came out around that time by a famous sociologist, Arlie Hochschild, called Strangers in Their Own Land, Anger and Mourning on the American Right. According to Hochschild, um, a lot of us are feeling like we don't belong here anymore. Like this isn't the place where that we used to feel belonging, or that when maybe we never did. But in any case, nobody really feels at home. Nobody feels comfortable here anyway. And that is driving a lot of anger. And if we don't see that, we're going to be kind of missing it. She, as a sociologist, develops this theoretical tool, but as philosophers, we have lots of precedent for this, the idea that we make sense of our lives in terms of stories. And then when you see the stories, you can really see things in a much clearer way. It's one of the things that we can contribute, even if we don't have studies and stuff. You know, this genealogical method has its flaws, but here's the idea is that people don't know what to do unless they know what story they're in. It's sort of a summary of Charles Taylor's communitarian narrative idea that we belong to stories. We need stories in order to make sense of our lives. Here's what Hochschild says. A deep story is a feels as if story. It's the story feelings tell. In the language of symbols, it removes judgment, it removes fact, it tells us how things feel. Such a story permits those on both sides of the political spectrum to stand back and explore the subjective prism through which the party on the other side sees the world. And so she tells the deep story of the American right in the following way. There's a line, and at the front of the line, on the top of the hill, is the American dream. And there's a lot of people in line, and you know they are good people. They've been working hard and doing their part. But lately, the line has stopped moving, and in fact, it seems to be going back. It's confusing. And then there's people who are starting to cut in line, and pretty soon you notice that up at the front, there's a bunch of line cutters, and that Obama, who is a line cutter himself, is waving them in, letting them just go. He's changing the rules, and it's not fair, and somebody's got to do something about it. So if you lay out the story like that, you can stand back and look at the story and say, "Oh, that's an interesting story. It certainly helps to make sense of a lot of things." In its way, it's a powerful, deep story. And then where do these stories come from? And if you wanted to intervene with somebody who had a story like this, how might you talk to them in a way that cuts through and changes on a deep level what's possible? As I mentioned, Jorge Portilla is part of a group of philosophers in Mexico City, about 9 of them, 4 of them here. They called themselves the Hyperion Group, and they worked very productively and prolifically in the 1940s and 50s, and then disbanded and went their own way. The central focus for them was the question of lo mexicano, the Mexican way of being. They were fascinated by phenomenological existentialism, these big questions about the meaning of life and the confrontation with nihilism and Jean-Paul Sartre, but they really wanted to know, why are Mexicans so interesting and weird and Mexican? What makes them so Mexican? And would you describe it? And they were just so interested in nationality. This was in the wake of the Mexican Revolution, when ideas of Mexicanness were really crucial to the government's strategy of uniting a country that had just engaged in civil war, engaging the artists, intellectuals, Diego Rivera, Frida Kahlo, the big muralists, to paint an idea of what Mexico was supposed to be and try to generate some of these deep stories. But by the 1940s and 50s, things had started to come apart. And they were fascinated by what is happening, and they wanted to theorize it. And what they noticed as they sort of saw Mexico sliding from these great ideals to contemporary state of quasi-narco state with with so much possibility, so much beauty, so much rich culture, and yet so many problems. They sort of saw it happening, and when you read their stuff here in the United States, it's as if they're talking about us. The resonance, the wisdom, the insight, the humor, the angles are all there. So let's dive in. Jorge Portilla, his main book, as I told you, is this phenomenology of relajo, which is a kind of disorganization. It's when group practices break down because people aren't taking them seriously. So he was really interested in seriousness and what brings people together and why they can't maintain these moods. What sort of interventions really shift the mood. He was so interested in the emotional side of politics. And that is really where my work comes from. I believe that we have to be more conversant with philosophy of emotion in order to do this work more effectively. Here's what Portilla says. So the theoretical payoff of his work in that text and in other places. He says that a lot of what we do, a lot of the way we make sense of the world, uh, it is organized in terms of concepts, ideas, sense of what's right, what's wrong, what's beautiful, what's ugly, what's macho, what's attractive, what is good, what's bad, all of these ideas that they fit together in packages that allow us to perform these routines and subroutines and to be a person, to carry on a personhood. But for some people, these packages, sort of the norms of their society, what's normal, how people think and feel, um, that in some societies, those norms are very coherent and stable. They have high degree of integrity. And for in other societies, there's a lot of disintegration. There's a lack of integrity. So here's how he describes this as a sort of spectrum between two sort of poles that you can imagine. The super integrated society would be sort of an ideal or fantasy, maybe the kind of Nazi fantasy of a fully coherent society and culture where, you don't have to code switch, that what you were doing in the classroom was totally aligned with what was happening in music and the arts and work and government, and everything was sort of helping to express a certain social unit that's coherent, a certain world view, a certain folk. On the other side, he says, is a sub-integrated society where, none of those things kind of make sense. You are always having to code switch to the point where you can't not do violence to yourself. You have to work for things that you would never do in church and be with your family in ways that you wouldn't, none of it kind of has any story. And in such a society, where there's not sort of a lot of coherence, Portilla says that there are certain effects of that, the predictable effects. And the way he describes it is it's a species of social malnutrition that forms a thin yet suffocating spiritual atmosphere for whomever must form their personality within it. And I like this metaphor in part because I have the sense that a lot of people feel like things are hard. It's harder to get people together. It's harder to get things going now in a certain way than it used to be. And just in the way that on high altitudes, there's not the plants don't grow as big. There's more scrubby. It's harder to kind of have that kind of flourishing that happens in, say, a jungle or rainforest or forest. So yeah, it's harder. Life is hard right now. We all kind of feel it. And Portilla says, he doesn't say, all of these Mexican philosophers were obsessed with this word. We're saying this is what it's like to be Mexican. It's called zozobra. It's an ordinary Spanish word for anxiety, but it has this connotation of soup and sobra, which is over under, and so sobrar is to to wobble and capsize. The idea that the very ground on which you stand, all of these deep stories, these normative structures, there is no stability. It's not in your head. And how can human beings, if we depend on these stories, how can we not feel seasick? And there's nothing you can do about it. You can't go to therapy about it. This is a normal response to such a historical moment. And here's how it feels. It feels like an anxious, oscillating uncertainty, an inability to feel at home in the world. And according to Portilla, there are four signs you might be in a disintegrating society. Top four signs for the clickbait. In such a society, people won't take as much action because if you don't know how your action will be received, what people will think about it, how they'll interpret it, then you might not act. Putting myself out there in public philosophy is scary a bit because I don't know how it'll be received. And there's a lot of people who don't take action in such a space. People in such a society will turn to the past with just profound nostalgia and feel cynical. The idea that, that there's no hope here, the system is fundamentally broken, that there's been a loss. And Portilla has this profound connection between zozobra and apocalyptic thinking. He says that when the protection of human society withdraws, the human being feels exposed to the cosmic vastness, and suddenly nature looks threatening. And when he writes about that here in this moment of ecological crisis, I think a lot of us are feeling that we are not sure really how much of this would be there if the disaster came to us in our, just an hour away. Hurricane Helene killed 140 people, and many people are still displaced. And so these kinds of stories they start to have a foothold in this context. So we wrote this book, Carlos and I, Carlos Sanchez, San Jose State. It was probably the most prominent philosopher in this area, and my friend and colleague. I'm so grateful to him. We wanted to promote it, and so in the 2020 election, we wrote this public piece of philosophy, trying to share some of the advice that Mexican philosophers have that we might be interested in. This was published the day before the election. People didn't have anything to do. They were so worried and they were just doom scrolling. And this article kind of went viral, I think, because it was like, what else are you going to do other than talk about this horrible feeling that, just things were falling apart, and yet it was so beautiful outside. And how do you hold, like, okay, I have my kid and I'm going to do my Zoom, but then it's like a beautiful day. And then election, climate change, pandemic. How do you just kind of switch your focus from one thing to the next? Every time the camera zooms out, you kind of lose your footing and feel this sort of wave of nausea. So that's the topic. I really like what Portilla has to say about it. And I'm kind of team Portilla. My co-author, Carlos, as I'll explain momentarily, is not. Here's what Portilla said. He came to visit the United States and walked away saying that, the writing's on the wall. This is a disintegrating society, and the United States is facing a spiritual crisis. I'll tell you more about this later, but I just want to give you the outline of the argument. The idea is, first, the US is a disintegrating society. That's why we're all so anxious, and this is a bad thing. And we can and should repair the social fabric, but we can and should try to do so in ways that won't make us even more defensive and neurotic. Okay, so I think each of these claims is true. It'd be interesting if you're not on board with Portilla's project, if you would disagree with one of these. And so it can help sort of identify where the points of disagreement might be. But according to Portilla, the old rules, what you can say, what you can't say, this idea, are we the good guys? Are we the bad guys? Maybe we're the bad guys, that suddenly our innocence was in question as Americans, and that we were on track for things to really fall apart. According to Carlos, who is partial to a another Mexican philosopher, Portilla's friend and colleague, Emilio Uranga. Emilio Uranga often pushes this line, what if uncertainty and crisis are the norm? Same basic analysis. This uncertainty and crisis makes us act very strangely and think very poorly about basic shared concerns. Can we find room in our hearts and our practices to hold all of that? Um, I I don't, however, think this is the norm, and I do think, well, I don't know. We'll see. We'll see if we actually end up uh, disagreeing at the end. Carlos comes from undocumented immigrants, a family of people who worked on the land and who have a foot in both Mexico and the United States. And he writes about it beautifully in his new memoir, which I highly recommend. And he has a one perspective, but my perspective on this, from his perspective, things for the most marginalized people, they've always been like that, right? I mean, it doesn't matter that much. It's like things are broken, they've been broken, but I have some personal experience that makes me more interested in exploring some of Portilla's ideas about fascism and engaging them in a more robust way. And um, that is, as a child, I had early exposure to Christian nationalism in the form of the kinds of things that you might see in this documentary film called Jesus Camp. It's a form of Christianity that's highly emotionally engaged, and reflecting on it, I felt I was manipulated. And so as a teenager, I rebelled and became a punk and got interested in debate and in philosophy, and kind of dedicated my life to counter indoctrination, critical thinking. And yet, I know that you can sometimes take the kid out of the church, but you can't take the church out of the kid, because I stand up here talking about, we should try to do the best we can to take care of each other. And I am giving my little sermons, and oh my Lord, it is just, the irony is too rich. Um, but this is a little bit about me. Now I have found my way to a more friendly relationship with Christianity, and I continue to be engaged with people in my own family who are very different from me in politics, and so this is kind of where I'm coming from. I want to engage with it with love, and with a sense of my own humility, and the things that I experienced in that space. Okay, so that's enough for introduction. The rest of this will go more quickly. Um, Portilla's argument in a nutshell, he looks at Mexico, the US, and Germany in these three different essays, each of which we publish, and so provides sort of a nice contrast and comparison. But the overall view is that our existence is ontologically structured by nationality. It's a thesis that I call phenomenological nationalism, in order to give credit to Portilla for this pretty provocative claim. According to Heidegger, human beings, our existence, the way we make sense of the world, the way we experience time and space, everything about our sense making is shaped by our mortality, the fact that we're going to die. That seems true. Uh, Feminist phenomenologists have pointed out that our experience on a phenomenological level, at that deep level, is shaped by gender and by sexism. That seems true. Portilla says, also, don't forget about nationality. This is deeply, deeply important to people, and at least for people like us. He doesn't define it. Remember, his focus is really on these three things, and it'll be interesting. I mean, at what point did we become national ontologically? But from his point of view, we are tied to the stories of our nations on an ontological level. The second big idea is that interventions that function to enact the deep story of national redemption through purifying violence feed the spiritual roots of fascism. And so we must commit ourselves to rationalism, to realism, and the hard work of liberation. So, yeah, I think it's this idea of enacting a story. We can find ourselves enacting a story that we don't believe rationally. And yet, when you start to look at that sort of more affective level, you can ask this question. And when you enact it, it becomes true. That's the strange thing about politics. Um, and so in the midst of this roaring sea, the idea is we have some meager tools, rationalism, uh, giving and asking for reasons, basing our beliefs on evidence, on this is a meager tool, but it's like a rudder that can help stable and steady the ship and hopefully help us navigate this moment. We have to maintain our institutions. We have to hold the center. We have to believe in science. We have to believe in deliberative democracy and make it believable. Invest in it. Hold the center. That's Portilla. Portilla, as I said, employs this genealogical method, looking not like a historian, but looking at novels to try to trace deep stories. He's not interested necessarily in the causal, like who knew who, but he traces these deep stories. And he says in German Romanticism, you find its deepest expression and that it disgusts him. He says, it offends me. Thomas Mann's work offends me, but more than that, it disgusts me. And so I'm just going to tear it apart. But it's an interesting thing because as we know, disgust is a response to invasion. You want to get something, a foreign body out of your body, say, no, this is a line. And if Portilla is right that a lot of our foundational beliefs are affective in nature instead of rational, then maybe, when it comes to foundational beliefs, disgust is kind of an appropriate response. But anyway, here's what he says. Germany produced a certain original kind of personality that was in a certain way exceptional, departing from the rational Christian and universalist spirit of the European tradition. In order to help me understand and help us understand German Romanticism, although you probably have more expertise than I do, I rely on the work of Charles Guyon, who has this handy little volume on being authentic. One of the chapters is on the romantic ideal of authenticity. And it is here that I think we can most easily sort of connect with this conversation in a more real way. According to Guyon, the three features of the romantic mind that continue to be important in our contemporary culture of authenticity are first, an attempt to recover a sense of oneness and wholeness that appears to have been lost with the rise of modernity. So I think this is really the heart of it. There is a feeling that modernity sucks. It's boring. It's meaningless. There's a sense of there's a hole in the center of things that just can't get filled. And in part, it's because things aren't human scale. Things aren't human. We're in this modern machine, and we face so much pressure to be productive, to work, and we're given our weekends. But it just feels like it's empty and disenchanted. And you know, wasn't it nice when we could be more like kids, where we could be more human, where we could have our sense of humor, where we share food? Can't we go back to the garden? Can't we recover some sense of the idea that we're in it together, that you can trust this world of ours? and that you can bring your whole person to these spaces. Uh, you know, you don't have to be so siloed. So I feel like this story really connects with people. And there's a deep desire in the United States to be authentic, to say, you know what, I'm going to be me. And that's important. And it's important to be me in part because this whole world, is kind of crazy and you think you have it figured out, but it's obvious you don't. So this is sort of the space of conversation. Second, the conviction that real truth is discovered not by rational reflection and scientific method, but by a total immersion in one's own deepest and most intense feelings. The idea that, you go inside and through the fractal nature of the universe, the truths inside will be revealed on the outside. If you don't have the eyes to see it, it won't be seen. And so if you don't see it, you need to do more inner work. So it's this feeling of resonance that starts to emerge as you sort of go inside and then learn to see the world in a certain way. And this approach, can cause a lot of problems. And as you sort of perfect or destroy yourself, as you try to find your way to seeing the world a certain way, you can do a lot of damage. And then number three is the discovery at the limits of all experience that the self is the highest and the most encompassing of all that is found in reality. And yeah, this fascination with limit experience that you kind of have to, have a vision quest and a big change where you disrupt lots of things, and when that becomes political, that is a dangerous story. Um, all right, let's go. Yeah, here we go. All right. So German irrationalism has this basic idea that reality is not rational. So don't try to be reality's crazy. Who knows how things really work. Don't be overly reliant on what you think you know. And besides, reality is not particularly conducive to happy and healthy human connections. So, it has this sort of departure from reality, and as a result, uh, becomes um, beholden to these forces: will to power, hatred of reason, and fidelity to death. It might be useful to think about what would be sort of the opposite. And here I think of Cornel West and his Christian democratic socialism, the idea that rationality is manifest and accessible to ordinary people who can therefore be trusted to governing themselves, that reality is rational. It's kind of obvious in most cases what you have to do. You can trust regular people to use the basic processes of deliberation and scientific method. And that the logic of life is not perverse, but offers the possibility of love, abundance, and forgiveness, as well as hardship, tragedy, unfairness, and evil, if we continue to work together to care for those in need. Portilla, I think, would love this because he looked around to Mexican society and he was so frustrated with all of these people who were cynical, who kind of looked the other way to corruption. And he said, look, these guys are so fun. They're fun to have as drinking buddies, these Cantinflas characters who are always joking around. And there is a certain way that does give you freedom, freedom from constraints. But real freedom is freedom for meaningful action. You have to have something you actually care about, that you are serious in order for that freedom to be meaningful. Freedom as pure negation is not more than a mirage and a deception, since the freedom from negative freedom is but the negative side of a freedom too. Negative freedom is but an aspect of positive freedom, and that is indeed a genuine liberation and opening up of the path for effective action in the realization of values. So that's what he's hoping for from Mexico. And he is a social critic and he looks around and, some people are just kind of class clown characters. Here in our country, we have a lot of class clown characters, who just kind of want to provoke and antagonize, break the background rules, and make the people who are serious seem pretentious. In fact, you have class clown in chief here in Donald Trump, that's sort of his main thing, is showing contempt for the background rules. But there's another way of of not being serious, and it's here in Octavio Paz, who, according to Portilla, was so focused on being politically correct that he would almost have a litmus test for writers. Were you really a true leftist, or were you really like an Anglophile, somebody who really wanted to be European and was just writing about love or whatever? And it became sort of political correctness gone crazy. And Portilla really calls him out on this. They were called the mafia. And he says, this is Machiavellian, us, them thinking. And at its root, it is not going to be what saves us. What we need is something we actually care about, some positive vision. Instead of saying no, we need to be able to say yes. Because according to Portilla, it's when we say yes together that we find meaning and when we find freedom. Meaningful life is a group project. We depend on each other. We need each other. There's no way around it. Here's his example. Imagine you're at a performance, a dance performance, and the people come in, the lights get low, dancer comes on stage, dances. Suddenly, people start, my God, this is beautiful. And people get quiet. And pretty soon, gracefulness starts radiating from the stage. It's extraordinary. And a lot of times people think that it's the dancer. But what Portilla says is that it's not just the dancer. Look at all the work that the audience members are doing in order to make this happen. You could have the same dance and it wouldn't be graceful if people were mocking, making farting noises, fighting amongst themselves. It would be ridiculous, and not graceful. The same moves. He says gracefulness undoubtedly rests on the dance technique learned laboriously by the performer, but also on recognition by the spectator. In a certain sense, it's a collective endeavor directed from within by a tacit agreement between performer and audience. It emerges precarious and vulnerable like a burgeoning that lays root in the field of harmony among dancers, musicians, and spectators. And it survives as something definitive, perfect, and stimulating in the memory of all these groups. So there's moments like this that is really where a meaningful life is built out of, these meaningful moments where things come together and you get to see something that you didn't make yourself. You couldn't do it yourself. And so you feel grateful. Wow, that's amazing. That's beautiful. I want that. That's worth protecting. It's vulnerable, though, because all of us have to keep the mood. If people go around killing the mood, these values cannot shine forth. So here's Portilla's view. Genuine freedom is only possible if we feel actually called by the values that emerge out of our shared life together, if we find meaning in our social practices. And our capacity to experience the call of such values depends on the coherence and stability of a society's horizon of understanding. What my neighbors do, whether they take basic values seriously or live in their own deep story, matters to me because there are values that will no longer be possible to emerge as between us. And number three, contemptuous norm violations, as well as corruption, cynicism, esotericism, denialism, and fantasies of redemption through purifying violence undermine the social practices that make it possible for us to live freely and meaningfully. So here we have Portilla, a social conservative, though a radical leftist, Marxist. It's a very interesting voice, but I think his vision of what philosophy is really inspiring. Philosophy, he says, has the function of promoting reason in a specific society, of clearly putting before the collective consciousness the ultimate base of its thinking, its feeling, its acting, these deep stories. Philosophy, to the extent that it is a logos on humankind, performs an educating and liberating function. The word logos, when I analyze things, it can pull me out of the magma of the situation and allow me to act in a manner contrary to the objective currents of obligation that flow from it, in a direction opposite to that of psychological habit, tradition, class, interest, and so on. The truth sets me free, and perhaps the ultimate sense of all authentic philosophy is this liberating operation of logos. All right. So, what does that have to do with today? Why talk about this mid-century Mexican philosopher? Well, according to Jorge Portilla, we would expect that the politics of today is a response to this crisis of a deep story, and in particular, a crisis of innocence. We have a country that's founded on big, ambitious ideas, very innocent, naive ideas about bigger is better, we can do it. And there's this constant desire to kind of return to party. We do have a sense of that the greatest generation really did have a moral core to it. And yet, of course, we know that it was also so problematic and white. And there's this feeling that maybe, we could party, we could keep the party going somehow. Portilla sees all of these sort of moments, and in his essay, which I recommend, as sort of indications of a certain cultural attitude that shows up time and time again, a kind of innocence. And the flip side of this is the desire for something more meaningful, for something more real. And Fight Club kind of expresses this romantic sense that, how could you know who you are if you've never been in a fight? These people who are corporate slaves or who are marginalized and bored, underemployed, they are just so desperate to feel something that they go to this club to get beat up and just feel pain, feel something. And it gives us this idea that it's just burn it down. This is soft. This is not going to cut it. And I think this can be a useful frame to understand Christian nationalism. The United States has to some extent lost the claim to absolute justification that is at the origin of its history. This is what Portilla writes in 1950s after visiting the United States. Consider the profound change in the temporal perspective, a shift that goes from the future to the past. He says, when you look at the United States intellectual history, this obsession with the future and all the things that we're going to do in the future was so characteristic. And yet around the 1950s, everyone's talking about going back to the past. He says, abandoning the protensive attitude for a retentive attitude is a clear indication of at least some difficulty in holding the assumptions of innocence. What the United States appears to now show the world is not an indeterminate future as a common task, but its own past as the source of self-justification. In the 1950s, he predicted Make America Great Again. Boom. And he says this is a nihilistic process because in order to maintain innocence, you have to identify and expel the invader, anything that threatens purity, and yet doing so makes you act in ways that are not pure, or the ways that are violent or exclusionary. And so, it has this self-reinforcing sort of movement between two extremes. Do we love it? Do we hate it? Religion, we have a very unique approach to that. And all of these other things, Portilla has a deep psychoanalysis of the United States. Here's just one little bit of it. He says it would be tempting to draw a parallel between the role of the unconscious in the individual psychic life and that of Black men in social life, and to show how precisely the refusal of the white man to assume his guilt before the man of color in the dark racial conflict of the U.S. is the ultimate basis of racial discrimination. Victim blaming. For the innocent person, when they do something that had good intentions, but maybe hurt somebody, let's say it was racist, now that person is a living embodiment of your lack of innocence, your guilt, their testimony, their very existence, their perspective, the fact that that now you are beholden to them, and who you are changes based on the stories that they tell. That becomes a threat. So you attack that thing, and you end up sort of in this nihilistic process. Christian nationalism, for those of you who don't know, the current movement has been galvanized around the idea of the seven mountains of influence, and that Christians need to take the seven mountains of influence: government, media, arts, entertainment, business, education, religion, and family. And that in each of the mountains that the liberals have taken over, that they have gained the media, they own the arts and entertainment, that the businesses have gone woke, and that Christians need to be atop the mountain. And for each mountain, you might need different things. So for the media, let's get all the attractive Christians to be in TVs and movies. That makes sense. And in government, you might need different qualities, more aggressive qualities than you might need in other spaces. And there's this idea that Donald Trump, although he's not a Christian, he is like a Cyrus figure. This is a deep story, and you'd be surprised at how firmly entrenched this is when you talk to the researchers. Cyrus was a king who was not a good person, but somebody who God used to execute his will in the bigger scheme of things. The idea is that Donald Trump is not a good person. He may not even understand his role in the bigger plan, but that he can be used to take the mountain. The truth is that the right has been studying what the left has done since the 60s and this grand pushback, this takeover, as the pendulum swung from the 1950s conservatism over. And then people who had been marginalized said, okay, we can find a place in the academy. We can make sure that the rules are changed so that our voices have more sway. The right has been studying these things and taking notes and has been trying to appropriate this. David Brooks is one of the people who are sort of in the trenches talking about this. He says the first great project of the National Conservatives is to man the barricades in the culture war, and that they've done their homework when it comes to cultural Marxism, how the left has learned to dominate culture and how the right now needs to copy their techniques. He was at the National Conservative Conference, and he says, if I had to drink a shot every time some speaker cited Herbert Marcuse or Antonio Gramsci, I'd be dead of alcohol poisoning. So it's possible that some of our people in the audience are from this far right, new right cohort, and are listening now precisely to reverse engineer all the things I'm saying. And if so, welcome. I welcome you here to this conversation. A lot of people don't believe that Donald Trump really would do any of the things that he's just saying it to get an effect. But the agenda of this Christian nationalism movement that he has allied himself with, they have made their plans very clear, at least in the context of this well-known Project 2025 agenda, which is a pretty clear statement of a return to something that looks a lot more like Christian fundamentalism. And of course, this is not just happening in the United States, but there is a populist, neo-populist, right-wing authoritarian streak that is visible on the world stage and has been for some time. I think I will dangle that out there rather than explore it at this moment. Maybe we can explore that in question and answer. But the reason why this matters to me is because in the future, as resources get scarce, I think we should prepare ourselves for the possibility that ecological language, green language, can be used by the powerful to justify injustice. And that although environmentalism is currently a leftist issue, it doesn't necessarily have to be that way, and it may not always. And it's important, I think, to not be too complacent about how the politics will line up for any given issue or any given population. Sometimes these deep stories are deeper than the political categories. And as disease and famine drives migration, and migration drives war, and war drives disease and famine and migration, and all of those things contribute as the world becomes warmer and more affected by climate change and so on. I think all of us really need to sort of check, although it doesn't sound like this could be used to justify horrible things, are there philosophical principles down there that could? Okay, Finally, my conclusion. Three things. First, a prediction. Philosophical conceptions of authenticity and health will be central social and political battlegrounds in the 21st century. I think this is useful because sometimes if you don't see it as authenticity, you may not you may not see it. And a lot of times health is so connected to it because our own relationships with our bodies are so relevant to this conversation about can I feel like myself? Can I be myself? Can I be free in that sense? And when you look at it that way, biotechnologies as they develop will give us the capacity to change our bodies and it will drive these questions about authenticity. And if the left doesn't have an answer to that, then we will be stuck with these responses. So, for example, abortion and transgender athletes, these are things that technology has made available with the ability to use medicines to have an abortion, to change your body. And those are, it's not necessarily that there's a transgender person, it's that what are you going to do about modernity? What's the story? What's the vision here? People, like this is the battleground. And if you don't see that it's authenticity, then you're sort of going to be saying, well, it's a human rights. And it's like, well, I believe in human rights too, but you don't have an answer to my basic question. So, a warning. In disintegrating societies, romantic narratives of redemption through purifying violence are dangerously alluring, and salient social political categories can shift rapidly. So, according to Marshall Berman in this book on the politics of authenticity, authenticity has always been sort of about an alienated worker sort of reclaiming, the alienated housewife. It's been generally leftist people wanting to come back to the garden, wanting to come back to the festival, in putting the right as the people who are maintaining the status quo capitalism. But it doesn't have to be like that. The festival can move. The hippies can become Silicon Valley, rich people, and that festival can go into the rural areas. It doesn't, and you won't necessarily know. Um, Here's from Thomas Mann. In an age that has no satisfying answer, it has to feel satisfying to the eternal question of why. If the life about a person in his own time seems, however stimulating, seems to be empty of food for his aspirations, if he privately recognizes it to be hopeless, viewless, helpless, opposing only a hollow silence to all the questions man puts consciously or unconsciously. And so my students, I just think about my students, they really don't believe that we have an answer to climate change. They really believe that things are hopeless. And a lot of them do. I mean, it's deep and it's powerful. And what happens to a person? In such a case, a certain lamenting of the personality is bound to occur. The more upright the character in question, the more conscientious characters end up being more susceptible. A sort of palsy, as it were, which may extend from his spiritual and moral over to his physical and organic part. And as you start to get depressed and you realize, oh man, maybe there's something wrong with my body, you can get yourself, well, I'll just treat my body, but now I'm feeling worse, but maybe I just need to do it more. The physical body is such a battleground for these spiritual questions. And when you bring authenticity and health together, you can get people into a place where they can really lose themselves to life, because we need each other. So here's a piece of advice. Advocates of deliberative democracy should recognize that the politics of authenticity are distinctive because rational deliberation is different for our most fundamental reasons, which are by nature, emotional, narratological, aesthetic, and national. So the national is what Portilla sort of brings, but this is, the Rawlsian ideal of deliberative democracy, where we translate our beliefs into language that other people can, rational people can deliberate on. This idea of giving and asking for reasons is only in terms of propositional statements. That just doesn't feel right. And so I'll just end with a cry from the heart, which is our world is facing these tipping points, as we know, with climate change, in which there's feedback loops that start to occur. As warming occurs, it's easier for more warming to occur. As ice thaws, it heats the ocean faster and thaws faster. As rainforests cease to produce their own weather, they can quickly become desertified. There are these moments in which there's a change of state in which you won't be able to get back. And the scientists are telling us that, it's about 5 years before some of these tipping points are crossed forever. And 5 years is us. That's us. That's me. And that's you listening. And if we don't authentically have an answer for ourselves, how are we going to meet our moment? Then how can we ask our students to pay attention if they see that it's not authentic, that we don't actually have an answer? Any reasonable person is going to put their hoodie up, put their earbuds in, and do the best they can to take care of themselves. I want my future back. Thank you.